My fellow Atlanta Falcons fans, today we address the state of the Falcons pass rush.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On NFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So today's episode, we are talking all about the Atlanta Falcons pass rush. We got an introductory press conference from Leonard Floyd, where he talked about his favorite wing order, his favorite pass rush moves, what it's going to be like playing for his hometown team. We'll circle back to Leonard Floyd because we want to start off today's episode with some positivity. But before we get to that positivity, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that makes it your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer and subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So the Falcons have added two veteran players to their pass rush this offseason, Leonard Floyd and ex-Chargers defensive tackle Morgan Fox. Initially, when those moves were made in that first wave of free agency, I was a little higher on the potential of Floyd than lower on Fox. But after watching the film, I'm a little higher on Fox and a lot lower on Floyd, but we'll circle back to that later. And so if you want to get more information on what Morgan Fox is bringing to the table, in addition to today's episode, go check out yesterday's episode where we had Locked On Chargers co-host David Drogemeyer giving his thoughts on Morgan Fox. And basically David said on that episode that Morgan Fox is primarily a situational pass rusher. That means he's going to be a guy that plays predominantly in the sub packages, nickel, rushing from the interior. He's not going to add a ton of value against the run, as David indicated. That's really the main difference between Morgan Fox and Grady Jarrett at this stage. That Grady Jarrett was one of the team's more disruptive run defenders along that defensive front. And that's not necessarily what Fox's game is. Now, we talked about with Grady Jarrett, assuming that the Falcons were going to retain him this season. Unfortunately, that is not the case. But we talked about him having a more reduced role and being more of that situational pass rusher. That he played about 65% of the snaps last season. And we were hoping that that number would be closer to maybe 45% of the snaps this season and more reflect what a situational role. And I think, when we project what Grady Jarrett could do in that role and look at what we project Morgan Fox to do in that role, I think there isn't a significant drop-off, I think, from Grady Jarrett to Morgan Fox. Now, I think Grady Jarrett, not in addition to the run defensive stuff, but as a pass rusher is better than Morgan Fox just because I think he has better hands, more quickness, just a better, more polished array of pass rush moves. But I do think Fox does have a handful of moves that are very effective. He has his go-to move is that sort of side scissors or swipe move. He also has a very effective bull rush. That was something I noted watching the film where like he would often use that swipe move against some of the lesser offensive linemen that he faced. But when he was facing quality guards like Joe Bitonio and Joe Tooney and whatnot, I saw him bullying those guys with that bull rush, and that was effective. And that kind of is why initially I was a little lower on Fox when I at least initially dipped my toes in the film, because I noted that drop off in production over the last 6 games. We talked about this where like you look at Morgan Fox's pass rush win rate after like week 12 compared to Grady Jarrett's over that span, and Morgan Fox's was half that number. And sort of, that's why I was asking David on yesterday's episode about, any potential fall off in Morgan Fox. But like, I thought was like, oh, he's beating these lesser guards with these swipe moves. And the reason why he fell off is in the latter half of the season because he was facing some better offensive lines and he wasn't able to beat up on those lesser guys. And then after watching more film, I don't think that was really an issue, right? In terms of the fall off. I think some of the drop in production that definitely was there. Some of that's owed to playing better offensive lines, including the Atlanta Falcons in those final 6 games. Some of that is owed to quarterbacks getting rid of the ball very quickly. Excuse me. Bo Nix. A-Dot Merchant, Bo Nix. And some of that was just, I think a couple of that was they fell behind in some games, and because teams were running the football more, Morgan Fox had less opportunities to get after the quarterback because, again, he's not necessarily a run defender. So I do feel like it's much more of a lateral move in terms of pass rush ability from going from Grady Jarrett at this stage in his career to what Morgan Fox is at this stage in his career. My expectations for Grady Jarrett going into the season was kind of going to be, yeah, that's probably a guy that's going to get you 2 to 3 sacks. That's a guy that can get you 25, 30, maybe more pressures. That's kind of what I expect from Morgan Fox this year in a Falcons uniform. And as David said, when you're paying that type of production, only $4 million a year, contrast with, potentially the $12 million or whatever that the Falcons probably would have needed to pay Grady Jarrett in order to retain him. That's a relative bargain. Now, you're not going to get me saying anything out of pocket on today's episode talking about, oh, Morgan Fox is better than Grady Jarrett, and it's like because of the price tag. I'm not going to say anything. There's no way I'm going to slander Grady Jarrett on this illustrious podcast. But I think part of the reason why you're getting a lower cost, you got to factor this in addition to the pass rush production, which is you're going to have to hide Morgan Fox on some of these early downs and rundowns that you weren't going to necessarily have to do with Grady Jarrett. And you also, Morgan Fox definitely benefited tremendously from playing, next to one of the best edge rushing duos in the NFL the last 3 seasons with Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack. And that is not a luxury that he's going to have here in Atlanta, unless you're convinced that, Arnold Ebiketie, Leonard Floyd, and the rookie edge rusher that the Falcons are definitely 100% going to take in round 1 this year are going to be able to provide similar value as Mack and Bosa. And while I do have some optimism for Arnold Ebiketie making the leap in a rookie, having some impact this year, more on all that later in today's episode, I don't have nearly as much optimism for what Leonard Floyd is going to do this upcoming season after taking a deeper look on his film, and we'll discuss that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, we know that there is nothing like watching your favorite teams live and in person, and getting tickets to see those teams shouldn't be stressful, and that's where Game Time comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute tickets at unbeatable prices. Sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Game Time is going to make it easier to get tickets thanks to their feature, Game Time Picks. This is a feature that filters out the fluff to only show you the incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And with seat views, we love those panoramic seat views. You don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout when you toggle that option off in the app, as well as Game Time's lowest price guaranteed. You can book with absolute confidence. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So Leonard Floyd is one of those players that I think it's easy to get enamored with what he can be in Atlanta if you focus primarily on quantity. And, I think the issue that we have here on this illustrious podcast is, we don't focus as much on quantity. We like to look at quality, and that's where Leonard Floyd becomes a little bit less impressive. Now, I went back and watched every single one of his pressures over at NFL Pro over the last 3 years, and there was a clear trend line of decline from 2022 when he was with the Rams to 23 with the Bills to this past year with the 49ers. And you see that reflected in some of the advanced metrics like pass rush win weight, according to PFF, where Floyd had an 11 pass rush win weight in 2022. It dipped to 10 in 23, and then it was 8.4 in 2024. And for the sake of comparison, Arnold Ebiketie's pass rush win weight over the last 2 years was around 12. Matthew Judon's was around 6 last year. Lorenzo Carter in his first 2 years in Atlanta was between 7 and 8. In 22 and 23, and then that was like 3.5 last year. So when you look at the quantity with Leonard Floyd in the sack production, he's been a guy that averages 9 sacks and 46 pressures over the last 3 years. But at face value, and that feels like at face value, that type of production is a massive upgrade over what the Falcons have had at the edge rusher position over the last couple of years, where they haven't really had anybody. Calais Campbell got close to 46 pressures. They haven't had anybody since 2019, and Vic Beasley, who had 8 sacks in 2019, come close to 9 sacks in a season. So it's that type of production is a welcome addition to the Falcons, especially when you just focus solely on quantity. But when you look at quality, I do feel like, especially the 2024 film, it does feel like you're more likely to get the type of production that, say, Lorenzo Carter gave you in 22 and 23 with Leonard Floyd moving forward based off of his win rates and watching the film. And that was, instead of 9 sacks and 46 pressures, Lorenzo Carter in 22 and 23 averaged 3.5 sacks and about 27 pressures. And that's not necessarily an upgrade over what the Falcons had in Matthew Judon last year at that sort of lead dog edge rusher when he had 5.5 sacks and 25 pressures. So, the quality of the sacks stood out. Also watching the film, and in this instance, we're counting half sacks as full ones, and borrowing a methodology from, friend of the show, Brandon Thorne, offensive line guru, but also does things called true sack rate, which is a qualitative measure of, how guys are winning and getting sacks as opposed to a quantitative measure. And one of the things that Brandon does is he looks at high quality sacks versus low quality sacks. And high quality is basically beating a blocker with a pass rush move. And low quality is often just an unblocked or schemed off of a stunt, something that doesn't require a special skill or move in order to win. And at least looking at my count of Leonard Floyd sack production, I know Brandon's count is slightly different, but not too far off this. In 2022, 3 out of Leonard Floyd's 9 sacks were high quality, so about 33%. In 23, it was 3 out of 11, so about 27%. So not too much difference there going from LA to Buffalo. But then there was a big drop off in 24 where it was 1 out of 10, so down to 10%. And you look at 5 out of his 10 sacks last year were those low quality ones where he was effectively on a stunt, right? 4 of them, I think he was the looper, and 1 of them he was the crash guy on a stunt. He also had 4 cleanup sacks last season. And, those are instances where he's finishing what another teammate started. And 2 of those included him being a looper on the stunt. And so when you look at the 8.5 sacks of Leonard Floyd in 2024 with the 49ers, a lot of it was based off of scheme, stunts, twists, and whatnot. And when we talked about Matthew Judon, when the Falcons acquired him last August, we talked about a Matthew Judon relative to his peers had a higher percentage of sort of those cleanup and low quality sacks that we're talking about with Leonard Floyd now, compared to the other guys that were double-digit guys. And basing it off of Brandon Thorne's breakdown, if you look at his Matthew Judon's combined production from 21 to 23, only about 27% of his sacks were high-quality ones. And you look at the other 14 guys that average double-digit sacks over that span of time, that average number for a double-digit sack guy is about 45% of high-quality sacks. So almost half of a quality pass rusher's sacks, he's beating offensive linemen with pass rush moves. So, what's interesting with Leonard Floyd, he mentioned in his presser that his favorite move is a cross chop. That was clear watching the film. But what was noticeable was how much fewer he was using the cross chop in 24 in comparison to previous years like 2023 and whatnot. He does have other moves like a bull rush, a long arm, inside spin move. So it's not like he's worthless or he's a guy that's purely operating off a scheme. But the level in which those pass rush moves were winning last year with the 49ers was significantly lower than what it was in the previous years. And that is worrisome, right? Where we talk about, what Leonard Floyd is going to be. He's traditionally been a more of a Robin to somebody else's Batman, whether that was Khalil Mack in Chicago, Aaron Donald in LA. He went to Buffalo. Von Miller was supposed to be the Batman there, but he was hurt and wasn't the same player. And so Greg Rousseau kind of stepped up and was the main guy for the Buffalo Bills in that 23 season. And obviously Floyd was supposed to be that guy last year with Nick Bosa in San Francisco as that Robin. And now he's going to come in Atlanta, and there is no Batman in Atlanta. And again, we can still be hopeful, Arnold Ebiketie, steps up, or, we get a dominant rookie season from the edge rushers that, again, the Falcons are definitely 100% taking in round 1 of this draft. But now here in Atlanta, Leonard Floyd is basically potentially going to have to stand on his own. And, these numbers in the film aren't necessarily suggesting to me that he's going to do a good job kind of standing on his own. And so if we are plotting Leonard Floyd on the spectrum, right? If on one end of the spectrum is, the idea of Matthew Judon, right? That when we were at the height of our Let Terry Cook era back in late August of last year, and we had these expectations of Matthew Judon getting 8 to 12 sacks and 50 plus pressures, and be that guy for the Falcons pass rush that has been sorely missing from this team for, the better part of a decade. That's one end of the spectrum. right? In terms of the best case scenario for a guy like Leonard Floyd. And then the opposite end of the spectrum, that's the idea of Judon. The opposite end is the reality of Lorenzo Carter, right? Basically what Lorenzo Carter was for this Falcon team when they first signed him in 22 and 23. I think Leonard Floyd, based off of the film over the last year and the trend line that is gone downward steadily over the last 3 years that probably will continue in year 4, that reality for Leonard Floyd is probably closer to Lorenzo Carter on that side of the spectrum. Not saying he's the same. He's probably better than Lorenzo Carter. I think he is, certainly because he has more array of pass rush moves. But in terms of what type of impact you can expect for him to have, I'm thinking it's going to be, a rich man's Lorenzo Carter is basically at this point in time. And we talked about this before, where it's like you're making a similar bet on Leonard Floyd that you made on Matthew Judon. That bet didn't pay off for you in a major way. They're both the same age, born about a month apart. They're both 32. Will be 33 when the season starts. And, I think you can make the argument that betting on Leonard Floyd is a arguably worse bet than betting on Matthew Judon like the Falcons did last summer, because I would argue that Judon's film at age 30 and 31 is better than Leonard Floyd's film. Although you can look at some of the PFF pass rush win rate metrics, and they're similar, right? That Judon's win rates were not meshing with what his sack production was. He was having win rates of like 8 and 11 in his last 2 years in New England as well. So, at least in this case, the bet that the Falcons are making is only wasting money and not wasting, and wasting money is probably stronger than I mean it, but you know what I'm saying? Like if the bet doesn't pay off, right, you're only wasting money instead of wasting a draft pick. And, that's more meaningful just because money is replaceable when it comes to the NFL and the salary cap versus draft picks or not. You get a replenishment of draft picks, but once you trade that pick away, you're not getting that back, right? In theory, once you spend the money, I guess it's not coming back. But like in theory, you can do other things to get that money back, I guess, cut other guys and free up things. So, it does, because of my lowered expectations on Leonard Floyd, it does put more emphasis, I think, on the Falcons getting this first round pick right, as well as getting more internal growth from the team's current pass rushers to kind of pick up the slack that they may be losing this year at that edge rusher position. So we will finish off today's episode trying to be optimistic about where that growth potential lies for this Falcons pass rush as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we are being very optimistic on this podcast by basically stating that the Falcons pass rush is currently slated to be, once again, one of the worst in the NFL. They finished with 31 sacks. That finished 31st in the league last year. They currently have 32 sacks on their roster, right? 20 of the 31 are coming back, and they lost 11 with the departures of Grady, Jarrett, and Matthew Judon and Eddie Goldman, etc. They've gained 12 between Morgan Fox and Leonard Floyd and Divine Diablo. But as we discussed, I'm not really expecting Leonard Floyd to put up 8.5 sacks this year like he did last year with the 49ers. And so, again, I'm expecting that number to be maybe closer to 3.5 sacks. So instead of gaining 12, maybe you're only gaining 7 or 8 sort of sacks. And so if you throw in the 4 or 5 sacks that you project for what is the typical 15th overall edge rusher selection over the last 15 or so years that they get in year one, essentially, if that proves true, you're kind of breaking even in terms of the pass rush right now. So, we're projecting somewhere in that low 30s for the pass rush. And so it's tough because, we remember the optimism back in 2023 here on this podcast, how excited we were about the direction that this team was headed, right? And we talked a lot that offseason with the additions of Dupree and Campbell and Onyemata. And it's like, hey, man, this is the best chance that this defense has had in almost 20 years to break 40 sacks. And they did break 40 sacks, right? Our optimism proved true in that time. And it was the idea, like, we're never going back, guys. Again, we may never be a great pass rush, but at least we'll be a competent one, a functional pass rush moving forward, because we're never going back to the cellar. And then lo and behold, Raheem and Terry are like, think again, Aaron, and my therapist is very appreciative of what those guys have done to single-handedly, or, maybe not single-handedly, but to go out of the way to dismantle the functional pass rush that the Falcons had 2 years ago. All right, because my therapist is like, hey, I appreciate the extra sessions that Aaron is getting in therapy this week to deal with all the nonsense that the Falcons are throwing at him. So, my therapist is very happy about it. I'm not particularly happy about it, but we'll see how that goes. But this emphasizes that if this Falcons pass rush isn't going to be the bottom 5 unit again this year, that they're going to need that internal growth, right? And when I say, and that's why I say I'm being optimistic, guys, when I say bottom 5, because the real conversation is, are they going to be bottom 1 this year? There's a very high probability that they'll be bottom 1 this year. So it's like we're saying bottom 5 because we're being optimistic here on the podcast, right? We'll be 28th in pass rush this year, right? Not 32nd. Of course, optimism, baby, right? So that therapy's working out real well for me. So if they do wind up exceeding those expectations, whatever you think, bottom 1, bottom 5, whatever it is, it's going to be from 3 potential facets, right? Internal growth from players already on the roster, a rookie and or rookies that have yet to add, production, do wind up adding production than what we typically expect from rookies, as well as, this team scheming up a rush like nobody's business. Now, as far as the scheme goes, again, I think we're going to see a lot of sim pressures this year, which will allow Caden Ellis to be featured quite a bit as a pass rusher this year. Again, reason number 402 why the Falcons taking a linebacker in round 1 is terrible idea to me. No jury in the state of Georgia will convict me for the crime I'm going to perpetuate to any Falcon fan who's out here pushing a linebacker agenda in round 1. Right? My lawyer is just going to show them, Your Honor, just look at Locked On Falcons podcast. Look at we're pleading insanity. The Atlanta Falcons and their inability to address their pass rush has driven my client insane. And my jury of my peers, who will be full of Falcon fans in the state of Georgia, will be like, yeah, he was justified in his actions. We cannot convict him and whatnot. So be on the lookout, guys. If you're out here pushing this linebacker in round 1 agenda, I don't want to hear the words Jahad Campbell come out of your mouth ever, or there'll be hell to pay. That's all I'll say. So we'll see what that, but that's where the scheme goes. Caden Ellis. We'll see what Jeff Ulbrich and Raheem Morris can cook up schematically. I'm not going to weigh down the podcast with the negativity on the scheme stuff. So we'll punt that to later in the offseason where it's like, all right, here we go. So, the rookie, we have hope, right? Mike Green clocked a 6.85 3-cone on Monday at his pro day. We still have the off-field concerns with Mike Green. That stuff is above my pay grade, but hey, on field, amen. That's what I like to see, baby. We've talked a lot on this podcast over the years about how agility tests correlate very highly or relatively highly. Again, nothing in football correlates highly. It's all random chaos. But if you're going to find patterns of correlations and whatnot, agility tests like 3-cone and short shuttle do correlate the most with actual pass rush production, whether it's sacks or pressures in the NFL, based off of all the research I've done. And trust me, guys, I've done a lot of research because it was just like, you guys know. So I've been thinking about pass rush for 2 decades, 3 decades, if we're being honest. But if there's going to be real growth for this pass rush, it's probably going to be internal, right? We expect Arnold Ebiketie, D'Angelo Malone, Zach Harrison, Ruka Roro, Braylon Trice, and Brandon Dorlus all to contribute more in 2025 than they contributed in 2024. The question is going to be, how much more are those contributions going to be? How much more growth are we going to get from those guys? Now, I think most of us would probably agree that Arnold Ebiketie, a.k.a. AK, is our biggest hope. He's the Obi-Wan Kenobi of this pass rush. And I remember last year, a lot of people were looking at the sort of quantitative aspect of Arnold Ebiketie's production in 2022, in 2023, and looking at how productive he was on a limited snap count in 2023, thinking that with an expanded snap count that he was going to get in 24, like he was a shoo-in for a breakout year and potentially a double-digit sack season. But, we here on Locked On Falcons, people that actually watch film and do research, I don't know why I'm being so shady on today's episode, but you know me. if I'm not going to throw shade at the Falcons, I got to throw shade at my Falcon fans, and not just the fans, just the knuckleheads that are wrong. That's it. Most Falcon fans are fine, right? It's that 10% that just like, what are you guys doing? What are you doing? But anyway, but we here on Locked On Falcons, right? We talked about the qualitative aspect of Arnold Ebiketie's production last year, and it did not suggest a player that was poised for some sort of double-digit sack season, right? Now we'll see. I'll probably wind up revisiting the Arnold Ebiketie film as we get closer to training camp and whatnot. But at least my recollection of the film and watching it in real time during the season is like, I do think the 2024 film is much more in line with, hey, it is possible that we might get that 8 to 12 sack season, that 50 plus pressure season that we were talking about Matthew Judon getting last year. Maybe that's on the table for someone like Arnold Ebiketie. So that to me is more plausible this year than it was a year ago. Again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, hey, that's, high probability of happening, but again, we can hope, guys. So, the other player that, I tend to have more hopes in is Zach Harrison. Right, we've seen him in both seasons in Atlanta, his first 2 years in Atlanta, play his best ball in the month of December. And the hope is in 2024, we can get kind of the December version of Zach Harrison in September through October, November. And then if he can continue to play even better ball in December and build off of that, then that is something that I think, gives you a little bit more optimism that he can bring a little bit more juice as a pass rusher as well. Now you look at the rookie class. Sorry for D'Angelo Malone. I know he gets the short shrift on this podcast, but it is what it is. That man's gonna be back if the Falcons, or should I say when the Falcons take an edge rusher in round 1, Malone is gonna be probably back playing special teams this year like he was the previous year. So that's why we're not going to spend too much time hyping up D'Angelo Malone on today's podcast. But, we look at last year's rookies. Braylon Trice missed all of last year with an ACL injury. Brandon Dorlus only played 8 snaps. Rook Roro barely passed 100 snaps last year. Wait, is that just it doesn't matter. Anyway, they didn't play, basically. And so because of that, like, we're not expecting, or at least, when I say I am not expecting huge contributions from those guys. I've seen some people, trying to hype up Braylon Trice and others and how these guys are poised for big year 2 jumps. Again, I expect year 2 jumps. I don't know if they're going to be big jumps, but, if we can get a little hop, right? If we can get like some production from those guys, a sack here, 2 sacks here, 10, 15, maybe even 20 pressures from each of those guys, right? Like, you look at the combined production of those guys last year, 0 sacks and 6 pressure from all 3 of those guys combined. And if that number is just like, hey, 4 or 5 sacks and 40, 45 pressures combined across those 3 guys, hey, that's nothing to scoff at. That's not, setting the world on fire, but that's significantly more. And we'll take all the help we can get, right? So the other aspect that's interesting to me is how the Falcons exactly build their pass rush, right? Again, I think you can assume, right, when you look at, okay, who's going to be that foursome on 3rd and 6 that can get after quarterback? Arnold Ebiketie right now, Leonard Floyd, Morgan Fox, right? Who's going to be the 4th guy? Again, is that going to be Kay Nellis? Because the Falcons going to be deploying, those simulated pressures and a lot more Ruby dime defense, that 3-2-6 defense, something that they wanted to do a lot in 2023. Then Troy Anderson got hurt and they kind of scrapped it. Now they have the ability to do that a little bit. Troy Anderson, we'll see if he's healthier, but he's still around. And you also add Divine Diablo, who has basically the same skill set as Troy Anderson. And so, if that's the plan, okay, well, let's add some bodies in the secondary, right? You feel good about maybe like 4 of the 6 guys that you need to play with 6 DBs in a dime defense right now. So add a corner, add a safety, and you'll probably feel a lot better about that group moving forward and have enough bodies to feel comfortable that even with an injury or 2 in the secondary, that you can still deploy that sort of dime defense, right? And then when you look at what type of traditional 4-man rush the Falcons going to have, who's going to be that 4th guy alongside Floyd, Fox, and AK, right? Ideally, that's a guy on the interior, right? Is that Zach Harrison kicking inside? Is that Ruka Roro, Brandon Dorlus? Could that be a rookie? Like guys like Shamar Stewart of Texas A&M, Michael Williams of Georgia, edge rushers on early downs, but I think it makes a lot of sense to kick those guys inside on passing downs where they could do plenty of damage potentially in comparison to maybe some of these other edge rushers that are a little bit more undersized and purely can only line up on the outside, like a Mike Green, like a Donovan Ezeracco, Jalen Walker, etc. Right. And so, there's one scenario where you could suggest, because you don't have that second D tackle, right? Where if the Falcons aren't going to take an edge rusher in round one, and I'm not going to immediately try to murder you with that suggestion. If you're suggesting, hey, Kenneth Grant of Michigan, Walter Nolan, Ole Miss, Derek Harmon, Oregon, one of these D tackles makes some sense for the Falcons, I'll let you finish your sentence before I kill you, okay? And do harmful things. I probably shouldn't say this stuff on the podcast. Get demonetized and whatnot. But I'm not worried about the Falcons taking an edge that doesn't complement, AK and Floyd. Because as I discussed earlier, it's like a decent chance we get to week 6, and it's like, Leonard, come here, Leonard. You see that spot on the bench? Can you go? Yeah, that spot right there next to Kentavious. Can you go plop down and see if it's warm for me? Oh, it's not? Okay. Sit there for like the next 3 hours and keep it warm for me. Good job. All right. Anyway, let's roll with this rookie and Arnold Ebiketie. So we'll see what the Falcons do. I think we're looking at this draft, and we're looking at edge, and we're looking at D tackle, we're looking at corner, we're looking at safety. These are absolute needs for the Falcons, not linebacker. It's fascinating to me that, BPA, best player available, hasn't really been mentioned that often this offseason in comparison to previous years. It's why we're going to continue to focus on this team drafting for need. Right now you have 5 picks. We kind of know where 4 of those 5 picks should be used, whether the Falcons actually do the sensible thing and use them. So we'll see. But hopefully, they'll have more than 5 picks, right? Whether that involves trading players between now and the draft, or trading back on draft weekend. We'll see. So I don't think it's totally hopeless when it comes to the Falcons pass rush. It's just hard to be hopeful just because we've seen this movie so many times. And that's why I think so many of us, including myself, are hopeful of the Falcons, going after and getting a big fish like Trey Hendrickson. That would at least, cause us to be like, oh, okay, this is actually a significant move forward for the Falcons, and not just betting on another 32-year-old pass rusher, a 30-year-old situational pass rusher, and a rookie to kind of save their pass rush, as well as Arnold Ebiketie. And so we'll see if the Falcons, add to this pass rush, or are we going to be sitting here depressed come May? So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. We should be joined by a guest on tomorrow's episode to talk more about the offseason moves and what their thoughts on. We'll have plenty of guests as the week unfolds, as we start to transition into full-time draft content, talking about those pass rushers, in addition to other positions that the Falcons may wind up drafting after round one. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast to get even more insight into this upcoming draft class at a variety of positions, not just the edge rusher. Check out Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson on Locked On NFL Draft. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.